Sometimes the hardest thing in life isn't starting over. It's watching everything you built disappear in a single night. For 46-year-old Silas Brennan, that moment came when a storm destroyed the small cabin he'd spent months building with his own hands. After living homeless in a van, that cabin wasn't just shelter, it was hope, a place where his daughter Mara could finally visit on weekends. Standing in the rain among the wreckage, Silas had a choice: give up or start again. He picked up his tools. With Mara's help, he began rebuilding something better. What they created wasn't just a new cabin. It was proof that family and determination can survive anything. Would their second chance finally give them the fresh start they needed? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months before the storm, Silas Brennan woke up in the back of a 1998 Dodge van with rust eating through the wheel wells and a cracked windshield he'd repaired twice with epoxy and hope. The morning light came through dirty windows, and he could see his breath in the cold air. He was parked behind a shuttered gas station on the edge of Milton County, the kind of place where nobody asked questions if you kept to yourself and moved along every few days. He was 46 years old, and this was his life. Silas pulled on his work boots, good leather ones he'd resoled himself 3 times, and stepped out into the November chill. His body ached in places it never used to, small reminders that youth was behind him and the years of hard work were catching up. He stretched, feeling his lower back protest, and walked to the gas station bathroom. The owner, a weary man named Hector, let him use the facilities in exchange for occasional handyman work. By 7:30, Silas was on his 3rd job site of the week. This one was a deck repair for a family outside town, and he worked steadily through the morning, replacing rotted boards and reinforcing the frame. The family, young parents with 2 small children, watched him work with a mixture of appreciation and discomfort. They paid him in cash at the end of the day, counting out bills with careful politeness, and he knew they saw him as something temporary, something to be grateful for, and then forgotten. He didn't mind. He'd learned not to mind. The work was good. Silas had been a carpenter for 25 years, back when he had a business, a house, a wife, back when his daughter Mara was small and would hand him nails while he built her a treehouse in the backyard. That was a different life, one that had unraveled slowly and then all at once. A recession that killed his small business, a marriage that couldn't survive the financial pressure, pride that kept him from asking for help until it was too late. He told himself it was temporary. The van, the odd jobs, the moving from town to town, just until he got back on his feet. That was 3 years ago. His phone rang as he was cleaning his tools. The screen showed a name that still made his heart clench, with equal parts love and regret: Mara. "Hey, kiddo," he said, trying to keep his voice light. "Dad." Her voice was tired. Mara was 24 now, working as a waitress at a diner 2 counties over, living in a small apartment she shared with a roommate. She was trying to figure out her life, just like he was, and he hated that he couldn't help her more. "How are you?" "Good, just finished a deck job. Nice people." He didn't mention the van, though she knew. They'd stopped pretending about his situation a long time ago. "How about you?" "I'm okay, tired. The dinner shift has been brutal." She paused, and he could hear the question in her silence. "Where are you staying?" "I've got a spot. It's fine." Another pause. "Dad, you can't keep living like this." "I know." And he did know. The shame of it sat in his chest like a stone. "I'm working on something. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about that." He told her about the land. It had taken him 2 months of searching, driving back roads and checking county listings, but he'd found it. 3 acres of forest land, cheap because it was remote, and the access road was terrible. The seller was an elderly widow who just wanted it gone, and Silas had saved enough from his jobs to make an offer she accepted. It wasn't much. The land was steep in places, rocky, covered in second-growth pine and oak, but it was his. "I'm going to build a cabin," he said. "Just something small. 1 room to start. But it'll be mine, Mara, ours, somewhere you could visit on weekends if you wanted. He heard her breath catch. Dad, do you have enough money for materials? I'll make it work. I've got some lumber salvaged from job sites, and I can scavenge more. The foundation will be simple, pier and beam. I know how to do this. I know you do. Her voice softened. When do you start? Next week. The following months became a rhythm of work and building. Silas would take carpentry jobs 3 or 4 days a week, earning enough for food and materials, then spend the remaining time on his land, working alone. He cleared a flat spot near the southern edge of the property, where the ground was most level and the morning sun came through the trees. He laid out the foundation with methodical care, setting concrete piers and leveling beams with the precision of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. The work was hard, harder than it used to be. His body protested every morning, his hands stiffened in the cold, and there were days when he wondered if he was crazy to try this alone. But there was something deeply satisfying about the process, about seeing the structure take shape from nothing. Each board he cut, each nail he drove, was a small act of defiance against the circumstances that had brought him low. He built the frame from 2x4s and 2x6s, constructing walls that would hold against wind and weather. The cabin would be 16 by 20 feet, small but enough. One main room with a sleeping loft above, a corner for a wood stove, space for a small kitchen along one wall. He salvaged windows from a demolition site, old farmhouse glass that someone else would have thrown away. He found a metal roof at a salvage yard, panels that were dented but functional. Mara came to visit on a Saturday in early spring, parking her old Honda on the rutted access road and walking the last 100 yards through the trees. Silas heard her coming and climbed down from the roof where he'd been working. She stood at the edge of the clearing, looking at the structure with wide eyes. "Dad," she said softly, "you really did it." The cabin wasn't finished. There was still interior work, insulation to add, the wood stove to install, but the bones were there. 4 walls, a roof, a door he'd hung himself. It looked small against the forest, humble and rough, but it was real. They spent the afternoon working together, and Silas felt something ease in his chest. Mara had always been good with her hands, something she'd learned from him when she was young. She helped him install the salvaged windows, holding them in place while he secured the frames, and for those hours it felt almost like old times, like they were a team again. "I saved this," she said during a break, pulling something from her backpack. It was an old sketchbook, its cover water-stained and worn, from when I was a kid. "I found it when I was cleaning out some boxes." Silas took it carefully, opening to pages filled with crayon drawings and childhood dreams. A house with a garden, a family of stick figures holding hands, a tree house that looked remarkably like the one he'd started building before everything fell apart. "I never finished that tree house," he said quietly. "I know, but you're finishing this." She looked at the cabin, then back at him. "That's what matters." By late spring, the cabin was done enough to use. Silas moved out of the van and into the single room, sleeping on a cot in the corner, cooking simple meals on a camping stove until he could afford the wood stove installation. It wasn't fancy, but it was dry, quiet, and his. For the first time in 3 years, he had an address, a place to call home. Mara started coming on weekends when she could get away from work. They'd sit on the small porch Silas had added to the front, drinking coffee in the morning and watching the forest come alive with birds and small animals. They talked about everything and nothing. Her dreams of going back to school, his plans to expand the cabin someday, memories of when she was small. "I'm proud of you," she said one evening as the sun set through the trees, "for not giving up." "I'm proud of you too," he replied. "You turned out better than I had any right to expect." It felt like they had a future again, something to build on, something that couldn't be taken away. And then came the storm. The storm came on a Tuesday night in late October, without the courtesy of a proper warning. Silas had heard the forecast mention rain, but nothing that prepared him for what rolled in from the northwest just after sunset. He was inside the cabin, heating soup on the camp stove and listening to an old radio when the wind began to pick up. At first it seemed manageable. The cabin had weathered storms before, spring squalls and summer thunderstorms that tested the roof and walls. But within 20 minutes, the wind had escalated from strong gusts to sustained fury. The metal roof began to groan and flex. Rain hammered against the walls with percussive force. Silas stood in the center of the room, watching the ceiling beams shudder. He'd built this structure with his own hands, knew every joint and connection, and he could feel it straining under the assault. The windows rattled in their frames. One of them, the beautiful farmhouse window he'd restored with such care, began to leak around the edges. He grabbed towels and tried to stuff them against the gaps, but the wind was finding every weakness. The door shook against its hinges. Outside, he could hear the massive pines creaking and swaying, their tops whipping back and forth against the night sky. Then he heard the crack. It was a sound that spoke of catastrophic failure, of wood giving way under impossible stress. Silas looked up just as a section of the roof tore free. Metal panels peeled back like paper, and rain poured into the cabin. He grabbed his waterproof duffel, the one that held his important papers, some photos, Mara's old sketchbook, and pushed it under the cot. Another crack, louder this time. A massive pine limb crashed through the compromised roof, splintering boards and sending debris across the room. Silas dove for cover, pressing himself against the far wall as the structure began to fail around him. He should leave. Every instinct told him to run, to get clear before the whole thing came down. But this was his home, everything he'd worked for, and some stubborn part of him refused to abandon it. He stayed pressed against the wall, watching his cabin tear itself apart, until a particularly violent gust lifted the remaining roof panels entirely off the frame. That's when he ran. Outside, the storm was apocalyptic. Wind drove rain horizontally across the clearing, and Silas could barely see 5 feet in front of him. He made it to the tree line and crouched behind a thick oak, watching as the cabin's walls began to bow and collapse. The sound was terrible, splintering wood, screeching metal, the crash of his belongings being destroyed. It took less than 10 minutes for the storm to reduce months of work to wreckage. By midnight, the worst had passed. The wind dropped to occasional gusts, and the rain settled into a steady drizzle. Silas walked slowly back to the clearing, his clothes soaked through, and stood looking at what remained. It was worse than he'd imagined. The roof was completely gone, panels scattered across the property like discarded toys. 3 of the 4 walls had collapsed inward. The salvaged windows were shattered. His cot, his tools, his few possessions, everything was buried under broken boards and sodden debris. Only the foundation and a few studs remained standing, skeletal fingers pointing at the dark sky. He stood in the rain for a long time, not moving, not thinking, just feeling the weight of it settle over him. This was supposed to be the end of starting over. This was supposed to be the place where his luck finally changed. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Somehow it had survived, protected in a waterproof case. The screen showed Mara's name. "Dad, are you okay? I saw on the news about the storm." "I'm fine." His voice came out flat, emotionless. "The cabin?" He looked at the wreckage. "It's gone, Mara, all of it." Silence on the other end. "Then I'm coming. Right now. Don't go anywhere. It's 1 in the morning. I don't care. I'll be there in 2 hours." She hung up before he could argue. Silas put the phone away and walked through the debris field, stepping carefully over broken boards and twisted metal. He found his duffel bag under the collapsed frame of the cot, miraculously dry. Inside, the photos and documents were safe. Mara's sketchbook was intact. Small mercies. He managed to retrieve his tool belt from the wreckage, and his old carpenter's hammer, the one with the taped handle that had been with him for 20 years. The head was still good, the handle still solid. He stood there holding it, this simple tool that had built 100 things, and felt something shift inside him. Most men would walk away. Most men would see this as a sign, a final message from the universe that some things weren't meant to be. He'd thought that himself, standing in the rain, feeling the full weight of defeat. But as he held that hammer, he thought about Mara driving through the night to be with him. He thought about the months of work that had gone into the first cabin, the satisfaction of building something with his own hands. He thought about the alternative, going back to the van, back to moving from town to town, back to having nothing. He'd built this once. He could build it again. Mara arrived just before 3 in the morning, her headlights cutting through the drizzle as she navigated the rough access road. She parked and ran to him, and he caught her in a hug that felt like the only solid thing left in the world. "Oh, Dad," she whispered, looking at the destruction. "I'm so sorry." They stood together in the clearing as dawn began to break, grey light revealing the full extent of the damage. It looked even worse in daylight, a complete loss. Everything scattered and broken, months of work erased in a single night. "What are you going to do?" Mara asked quietly. Silas bent down and picked up a salvage board, checking it for damage. Still good. He found another, then another. Some of the lumber could be saved, some of the metal roofing. The foundation was intact. He had his tools. "I'm going to rebuild," he said simply. Mara looked at him with surprise and something else, something that might have been pride or might have been concern. "By yourself?" He met her eyes. "I was hoping you might help." She was quiet for a moment, looking from him to the wreckage and back again. Then she nodded slowly. Yeah, I can take some time off work. We'll do it together." As the sun rose higher, they began sorting through the debris, separating what could be salvaged from what was truly lost. It was slow, methodical work, but it gave them something to do besides stare at the destruction. They worked side by side, father and daughter, beginning the long process of starting over. Again. The morning after the storm felt like waking up in someone else's life. Silas and Mara had spent the night in her car, seats reclined as far as they'd go, getting maybe 2 hours of sleep between them. When dawn came properly, they stepped back into the clearing and faced the work ahead. "We need a plan," Mara said, surveying the wreckage with her hands on her hips. She looked tired but determined, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "We can't just start throwing boards around." Silas nodded. She was right. The first cabin had been built from desperation and whatever materials he could scavenge. This time needed to be different, more intentional, stronger. They spent the first hour simply walking the perimeter, assessing what remained. The concrete piers that formed the foundation were undamaged, solid and level, exactly as Silas had set them months ago. That was something. The frame lumber scattered across the property was mostly salvageable, though some pieces had cracked or splintered beyond use. The metal roofing was dented, but could be straightened and reused. "We'll need more lumber for sure," Silas said, making mental calculations. 2x6s for the new frame, plywood for sheathing. "And we should do this right, add proper insulation this time, maybe make it a bit larger." "How much larger?" "Another 4 feet on the length. Give us room for a real kitchen area, maybe a small bathroom eventually." He caught himself, hearing the optimism in his voice and wondering if it was foolish. "If we can afford it." Mara pulled out her phone and opened a notes app. "Let's make a list. Everything we need, everything we have, everything we can salvage. Then we'll know what we're actually dealing with." They worked methodically through the morning, creating piles, good lumber, damaged lumber, metal roofing, hardware and fasteners they could reuse. And finally, the pile of things too broken to save. Silas found himself remembering the construction of each piece as they sorted. This board had been part of the west wall, that one from the sleeping loft. It felt like conducting an autopsy on something he'd loved. Around noon, they heard an engine laboring up the access road. A dusty pickup truck emerged from the trees, and Silas recognized it immediately. Floyd Hutchins, his nearest neighbor at 73 years old, climbed out slowly, favoring his left leg. "Heard about the storm," Floyd said by way of greeting. He looked at the wreckage and shook his head. "That's a damn shame, Silas. You put good work into that cabin. Appreciate you coming out." "Floyd!" The older man walked the perimeter with them, occasionally bending to examine a piece of lumber or test the foundation with his boot. Floyd had been a surveyor before he retired, and he still had the careful eye of someone who understood how things should be built. "Foundation's good," he confirmed. "That's half the battle right there. You planning to rebuild? We are, Mara answered before Silas could. Together this time, Floyd smiled at her. Smart girl. 2 sets of hands make lighter work. He turned to Silas. I've got some extra tar paper in my barn, and a box of roofing nails. You're welcome to them. Floyd, I can't. You can, and you will. Neighbors help neighbors. Besides, I've got no use for them anymore. He clapped Silas on the shoulder. I'll bring them by tomorrow. And if you need an extra hand with the heavy lifting, you let me know. I'm old, but I'm not useless yet. After Floyd left, they took a break sitting on the tailgate of Mara's car and eating sandwiches she'd brought from home. The physical work had helped. It gave them something to do, besides think about how overwhelming the task ahead really was. I remember when you taught me to use a hammer, Mara said quietly. I was maybe 8 years old. You let me help you build that garden shed behind the house. Silas smiled at the memory. You hit your thumb on the first try. And you didn't make fun of me. You just showed me again, slower. Made sure I understood the motion. She looked at him. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. All the things you taught me before everything fell apart. I should have taught you more. Should have been there more consistently. You're here now. She hopped off the tailgate. Come on. Let's mark out the new foundation. They spent the afternoon with string line and measuring tape, staking out the corners of what would be the new cabin. 20 feet by 20 feet this time, enough room to breathe, to have distinct areas for sleeping, cooking, living. Silas drove 4 wooden stakes into the ground, at the corners, wrapping each one with red surveyor's tape that Floyd had left behind years ago. These stakes felt different than the ones he'd used for the first cabin. Those had been placed in desperation, a homeless man trying to claw his way back to stability. These stakes were placed with intention, with planning, with his daughter beside him. They represented partnership. As the sun began to set, they'd sorted all the salvageable materials and created a detailed list of what they'd need to purchase. The numbers weren't encouraging. Even with Floyd's donations and the materials they could reuse, Silas estimated they'd need at least $3,000 for lumber, roofing, windows, and basic fixtures. He had $400 saved. I can contribute some, Mara offered, reading his expression. I've got about $800 in savings. Mara, that's your money. It's our cabin, Dad. Our project. She met his eyes with a stubbornness he recognized from her childhood. We're doing this together, remember? They worked until dark, organizing the salvaged materials and covering everything with tarps Floyd had also contributed. By the time they were done, Silas's back ached and his hands were raw, but they'd accomplished something. The chaos had been sorted into order. The wreckage had been transformed into resources. That night, they returned to Mara's apartment, a small 1-bedroom she shared with a roommate who was thankfully away for the week. Silas took the couch, grateful for a real roof and walls, even if they weren't his own. They sat together in the small living room, Mara sketching possible layouts on graph paper while Silas reviewed the materials list. We're going to need more money, he said finally. I can pick up extra carpentry work, maybe a few longer projects, and I'll take extra shifts at the diner. Mara looked up from her sketches. Dad, I need to ask you something. Why is this so important to you? The cabin, I mean. You could find a room to rent somewhere, get a regular job, have an easier life. Silas was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Because I need to prove something. To myself, maybe. That I can still build something that lasts. That I'm not just, he paused, the words catching, that I'm not just a man who lost everything and gave up. You never gave up. I came close. He looked at her. Having you here, working on this together, it means more than you know. She reached over and squeezed his hand. We're going to build something amazing, Dad, something that'll stand through any storm. 3 weeks into the rebuild, Silas woke before dawn in Mara's apartment and dressed quietly in the dark. He'd been taking carpentry jobs 4 days a week now, leaving early and returning late, his body exhausted, but his wallet slowly growing heavier. Every dollar went into a coffee can on Mara's kitchen counter, their building fund that climbed with painful slowness toward what they needed. Mara had taken time off from the diner, 2 weeks unpaid leave that her manager had grudgingly approved. She spent those days at the property, working on the foundation and framing, while Silas earned money in town. They developed a rhythm. He'd leave instructions each morning, and she'd send him photos throughout the day showing her progress. This morning, though, they were both going to the property. It was Saturday, and they had serious work to do. The foundation was ready. Silas had spent the previous weekend reinforcing the pier and beam system, adding extra support where the storm had revealed weaknesses. Now the dimensional lumber was stacked and ready. 2x6s they'd bought at cost, from a supplier who'd heard their story and given them a contractor's discount. "Ready to frame some walls?" Silas asked, as they pulled up to the property. Mara climbed out of the car, wearing his old tool belt. It was too large for her, the leather worn and shaped to his body, but she refused to adjust it. She'd been wearing it for 3 weeks now, and Silas had noticed her competence growing daily. What had started as tentative hammer swings had become confident, efficient strikes. They worked through the morning, cutting studs and assembling wall frames on the ground before raising them into place. It was demanding work that required coordination and communication. Mara learned to read his gestures, to anticipate when he needed another board or a different tool. They moved together like a team that had been doing this for years instead of weeks. Around midday, Floyd arrived with a cooler of lemonade and sandwiches his late wife's recipe had inspired him to make. He sat on an overturned bucket and watched them work, occasionally offering advice or steadying a board while they secured it. "You've got a good apprentice there, Silas," Floyd said, nodding toward Mara. "She's better than good. She's got the instinct for it." Silas wiped sweat from his forehead. "Can't teach that." During their lunch break, sitting in the shade of the pines, Floyd asked the question Silas had been avoiding thinking about too deeply. "You mind if I ask what happened? I mean, how a man with your skills ends up living in a van?" Silas was quiet for a moment, but something about Floyd's gentle tone made him want to answer honestly. "I had a carpentry business. Did custom work, renovations, some new construction. Was doing pretty well for about 15 years. What changed? The recession hit hard. I'd taken out loans to buy better equipment, expand the business. When the work dried up, I couldn't make the payments. Lost the business, then the house. My wife Christine..." He paused, the name still difficult after all these years. "She tried to hold on, but I wasn't easy to live with. I was angry all the time, proud, refused help from anyone. She finally took Mara and left. Mara had stopped eating, listening to her father tell a story she'd only known pieces of. I convinced myself I could rebuild quickly," Silas continued. "Took whatever work I could find, but I was too proud to file bankruptcy, too stubborn to ask for assistance. Just kept digging the hole deeper. Eventually the apartment went too. The van was all I had left. And you've been on the road since then? 3 years. Moving county to county. Taking day jobs, sleeping in parking lots." He looked at the cabin frame rising before them. "This land, this cabin, it's the first permanent thing I've had since I lost everything. It matters." Floyd nodded slowly. "My wife passed 4 years ago. Cancer. After she was gone, I thought about selling the property, moving to one of those senior communities. But then I realized, the house we built together, that's where her memory lives. Sometimes holding on to a place means holding on to yourself." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. 3 people connected by the understanding that home meant more than walls and a roof. The afternoon brought new challenges. Mara was cutting joists for the floor when Silas heard her curse, a rare sound that made him look up sharply. She was standing over the saw, staring at a board she'd just cut. "What's wrong?" "I measured wrong." Her voice was tight with frustration. "Cut it 4 inches too short. That's a $12 board wasted." Silas walked over and examined the cut. She was right. The measurement was off, and the joist was now useless for its intended purpose. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw clenched against disappointment. "It happens," he said calmly. "I've wasted more lumber than you can imagine. We don't have money to waste." "No, we don't. But we have enough to absorb one mistake." He picked up the shortened board. This isn't waste. We'll use it for blocking between the joists. Nothing's truly wasted if you're creative enough. He spent the next hour teaching her how to double-check measurements, how to mark boards clearly. Before cutting, how to account for the saw blade's width. She listened intently, and he could see her filing away each lesson, building a mental library of carpentry knowledge. By the end of the day, they'd framed 3 of the 4 walls, and Mara had successfully cut a dozen joists without error. The structure was beginning to take shape, rising from the foundation like a promise being kept. As they were cleaning up, a pickup truck Silas didn't recognize pulled up the access road. A woman in her 50s stepped out, wearing a church volunteer shirt and carrying a wooden crate. "Are you Silas Brennan?" she called. "I am. I'm Janet from Militant Community Church. We heard about your situation, about the storm and the rebuild. The congregation took up a collection." She hefted the crate. 4 new windows. They're not fancy, but they're double pane and they seal properly. Silas stared at her, momentarily speechless. "Ma'am, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll accept them. We help our neighbors. That's what we do." She smiled at Mara. "You must be his daughter. Word around town is you two are building something special here." After Janet left, Silas and Mara unpacked the windows carefully. They were basic vinyl frame units, but they were new, properly sized, and worth at least $400. Silas felt something catch in his throat. "People are good," Mara said softly. "I forget that sometimes." "So do I." That evening, they sat on the foundation they'd built, looking at the framed walls silhouetted against the sunset. The structure was still skeletal, incomplete, but it was undeniably real. Silas pulled out his old carpenter's hammer and began carving something into one of the corner posts, careful, deliberate marks. "What are you doing?" Mara asked. "Leaving a mark so we remember this." He carved 2 sets of initials, SB and MB. "The day we really became partners." 6 weeks into the rebuild, the cabin had walls and a roof frame, and Silas was beginning to believe they might actually finish before winter set in hard. He'd taken a 3-day carpentry job in town, remodeling a kitchen for a retired dentist, and the pay would cover the electrical supplies they needed. Mara was at the property, installing the donated windows with Floyd's supervision. He didn't expect to see Christine's car parked at the property when he arrived that afternoon. His ex-wife stood at the edge of the clearing, arms crossed, watching Mara work on a window frame. She wore professional clothes, slacks and a blazer, and looked exactly as he remembered, composed, guarded, still beautiful in a way that made his chest ache with old regrets. "Hello, Silas," she said when she noticed him. "Christine," he kept his voice neutral. "What are you doing here?" "Mara told me about the cabin. I wanted to see it for myself." Mara had climbed down from her ladder and stood between them, clearly uncomfortable. Floyd had made himself scarce, retreating to his truck with unusual speed for a man his age. "It's looking good, Dad," Mara said, trying to ease the tension. "I got 3 windows installed today." "You did great work." Silas couldn't take his eyes off Christine. 15 years since the divorce, and she still had the power to make him feel like he was standing on unstable ground. Christine walked closer to the structure, examining it with the critical eye of someone evaluating an investment. "You built this yourself?" "We built it," Mara corrected. "Together." "It's impressive." Christine's tone was carefully neutral. "But Silas, can we talk privately?" They walked to the edge of the clearing, out of Mara's earshot. The forest was quiet around them, just the wind in the pines and the distant sound of a woodpecker. "Why are you really here?" Silas asked. Christine pulled an envelope from her purse. "I need you to sign these." "They're additional paperwork from the divorce settlement. My lawyer found some loose ends that need to be finalized." He took the papers, scanning them quickly. Legal language, property divisions that should have been settled years ago, final dissolutions of partnerships that had ended long before the ink dried. "After 15 years, you need this now?" "I'm getting remarried." She said it simply, without drama. "Gerald is a good man, an accountant. We want to make sure everything from my past is properly closed before we move forward." Silas felt nothing. No jealousy, no pain, just a distant sense of things ending that had already ended long ago. I'm happy for you, genuinely. Are you? She looked at him closely. Because Mara says you're living out here in an unfinished cabin, working odd jobs, barely scraping by. That doesn't sound like happiness. It's honest work, honest living. It's poverty, Silas, and you're dragging our daughter into it. Christine's composure cracked slightly. She took unpaid leave from her job. She's spending her savings on lumber and nails for a cabin in the middle of nowhere. Don't you see what you're doing to her? I see a young woman making her own choices, learning valuable skills, building something with her own hands. She should be in school, building a career, not playing construction worker in the woods because her father can't get his life together. The words stung because they echoed his own fears, the doubts that kept him awake at night. But before he could respond, Mara's voice cut across the clearing. "Mom, that's enough!" She walked toward them with determined strides, still wearing Silas's old tool belt, her hands dusty with work. "You don't get to come here and criticize what we're doing. You don't understand it. I understand that you're 24 years old, with no degree, no career prospects, and you're wasting your time." "I'm not wasting anything. I'm learning. I'm building. I'm with my father." Mara's voice was steady but fierce. "Do you know what it's like to watch your parent lose everything and keep going anyway? To see someone refuse to quit even when quitting would be easier? That's what Dad's teaching me. That's worth more than any college course." Christine looked between them, and Silas saw something shift in her expression. Not agreement, but perhaps understanding, or at least resignation. "I just want you to have opportunities," Christine said quietly to Mara. "Real opportunities, security. I know you do, but this is my choice." After Christine left, Silas having signed the papers, without further argument, they returned to work in silence. The confrontation had left tension in the air, unsaid things hovering between them. Floyd returned from his truck, reading the situation with the wisdom of his years. "Family's complicated," he said simply. "My son wanted me to sell this property, move to Arizona near him. Couldn't understand why I'd want to stay in an old house in the woods. Sometimes people who love us can't see what we need." "She's not wrong, though," Silas said quietly. "Mara should have more than this. You're giving her something a lot of young people never get," Floyd replied. "You're teaching her that she can build her own life, literally and figuratively. That failure isn't permanent. That's valuable knowledge." That evening, as they prepared to leave for the night, Mara stopped Silas at his truck. "Was Mom right? Am I wasting my time here?" "Do you feel like you're wasting time?" She considered the question seriously. "No, I feel like I'm learning who I am, what I'm capable of. I feel like—" She paused, searching for words. "Like I'm building more than just a cabin." "Then that's your answer." Over the next week, they settled back into their rhythm, but something had shifted. Mara worked with renewed intensity, as if proving something to herself. She mastered techniques Silas showed her, and started suggesting improvements he hadn't considered. When they installed the metal roofing, straightening and reusing the panels from the first cabin, she climbed the ladder without hesitation, working at heights that would have terrified her weeks ago. Floyd's visits became more frequent, though Silas noticed the older man moved slower, tired more easily. One afternoon, Floyd brought them lunch and stayed to watch them work on the interior framing. "You're doing good work here," he said. "Both of you. This cabin's going to stand for 50 years, way I see it." "Thanks to your help," Silas replied. "The materials you've given us, the advice, we couldn't have done this without you." Floyd waved the gratitude away. "I like having a project to follow. Gives me a reason to get up in the morning." He was quiet for a moment. "My Susan and I built our house together, you know. Took us 3 years. Best 3 years of my life." As the sun set, they stood back and looked at their progress. The cabin had walls, a roof, windows that actually sealed. The interior was still rough, exposed studs and plywood subfloor, but it was recognizably a home. Silas began working on something in the evening light, carving carefully into a piece of oak salvaged from the old cabin. "What's that?" Mara asked. "Door handle. I want to make something special, something that shows this isn't just shelter, it's a home." He carved a simple leaf pattern into the wood, letting the natural grain guide his design. 2 months into the rebuild, Silas made a decision he'd been avoiding. The money was running out faster than he'd calculated, and they were still weeks away from completion. The cabin needed insulation, interior walls, a proper wood stove, plumbing fixtures for the small bathroom they'd framed. He couldn't ask Mara for more of her savings, and he couldn't keep borrowing materials from Floyd's generosity. He took a job with a construction company in town, 3 days a week, steady pay, working on a commercial renovation project. It meant leaving Mara to work alone at the property, but there was no other choice. "I can handle it," she assured him the first morning he left for the job. "I've got the plans. I know what needs to be done. Don't do anything on the roof without Floyd there," Silas said. "And if you're not sure about something, wait for me, Dad. I've got this." He drove away feeling equal parts pride and anxiety, watching her in the rearview mirror as she stood in front of the cabin, wearing his tool belt, looking more confident than he'd ever seen her. The construction job was decent work, with a crew of younger men who treated Silas with the casual respect given to older tradesmen. He was competent and reliable, and the foreman quickly started giving him more complex tasks. The paychecks were steady, and each one brought them closer to finishing the cabin. But the days apart created a different rhythm. Silas would return to the property in the evenings to find Mara's progress. Interior walls framed, electrical boxes installed, the loft floor completed. She sent him photos throughout the day, documenting each step, asking for advice when she needed it, but mostly just showing him what she'd accomplished. One evening he arrived to find something wrong. Mara was sitting on the foundation, her shoulders slumped, surrounded by several long boards that looked like they'd been cut incorrectly. "What happened?" "I messed up the joists for the bathroom." Her voice was flat with frustration. "Cut them all at the same length without accounting for the header." "All 6 of them." "That's almost $200 in lumber wasted." Silas examined the boards. She was right. They were all cut 4 inches too long for their intended purpose. It was an expensive mistake, the kind that could set them back significantly. He sat down beside her on the foundation. "Tell me what happened." "I was in a hurry, trying to get everything done before you got home, so you could see the progress. I measured once instead of twice, didn't think it through." She looked at him with reddened eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad. I know we can't afford mistakes like this." "No, we can't." He picked up one of the boards, examining it thoughtfully. "But mistakes are part of learning. I've wasted more lumber in my career than we've used in this entire build. That doesn't help us now." "Actually, it does." He stood up, pulling her to her feet. "These joists are too long for the bathroom, but they're perfect for the main room ceiling. We can use them for support beams. They're exactly the right dimension." He spent the next hour showing her how to adapt, how to see mistakes not as failures, but as opportunities to solve problems differently. They repositioned the boards, and by the time the sun set, they'd turned her error into an improvement. The main room would have exposed beam ceiling that added character to the space. "You really never get frustrated?" Mara asked as they packed up for the night. "I get frustrated all the time. I just try to remember that building anything worthwhile involves setbacks. The key is not letting the setbacks stop you." The following week brought unexpected news. The church group that had donated windows returned, this time with a small delegation led by Janet. "We heard you're still working on the cabin," she said. "The congregation wanted to help more. We've collected donations, materials, and money. It's not a fortune, but it should help." They unloaded boxes from a church van, insulation bats, interior paint, light fixtures, plumbing supplies, and an envelope containing $800 in cash. Silas stood speechless, overwhelmed by the generosity. Mara wiped tears from her eyes as she helped carry boxes into the cabin. "Why are you doing this?" Silas finally managed to ask. "Because your story matters," Janet said simply. "A father and daughter rebuilding together, not giving up after losing everything. That's the kind of story that reminds people what community means. You're not alone in this." After they left, Silas and Mara sat on the porch he'd recently completed, looking at the donated supplies stacked inside. I didn't realize people were paying attention, Mara said quietly. Neither did I. The donations accelerated their progress significantly. With proper insulation and interior materials, they could finish the cabin before the worst of winter arrived. Mara had returned to work at the diner, but came to the property every weekend and most evenings, working by lantern light when necessary. Floyd's visits, however, had become less frequent. When he did come by, he moved carefully, and Silas noticed he was thinner, his breathing sometimes labored. "You feeling all right?" Silas asked one afternoon when Floyd arrived and immediately sat down on a bucket. "Old age," Floyd said dismissively. "Everything takes more effort than it used to." But there was something in his eyes that worried Silas, a fatigue that went beyond normal tiredness. They worked through October and into November, racing against the approaching winter. The cabin interior took shape with drywall and paint, giving the space a finished quality that made it feel like an actual home. Silas installed the wood stove, running the chimney pipe through the roof with exacting care. They laid vinyl plank flooring that Mara had found on sale, transforming the plywood subfloor into something that looked almost elegant in its simplicity. The door handle Silas had been carving was nearly finished, an intricate leaf pattern that caught the light beautifully. He worked on it during quiet evenings, perfecting each curve and detail. It would be the final piece, the signature that said this cabin was built with care and intention. One evening, as they were installing the kitchen cabinets they'd assembled from a kit, Mara stopped working and looked around the space. "It's really happening," she said. "This is really becoming a home." "It is. I've been thinking." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "When this is done, I might want to go to trade school, learn construction properly, get certified as a contractor." Silas felt something warm spread through his chest. "You'd be good at it." "You think so?" "I know so. You've got the skills and the temperament. More importantly, you've got the persistence. That's what separates people who succeed in this work from people who don't." She smiled, returning to work on the cabinet installation. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, light flakes drifting past the windows. Inside the cabin, father and daughter worked together, building something that would last. The cabin was 3 weeks from completion when the certified letter arrived. Silas had just returned from his construction job, tired but satisfied with the day's work. He found the envelope wedged in the door of Mara's apartment, marked with official county seals and the words, "Important legal notice," stamped across the front. He opened it standing in the hallway, and the words on the page made his vision narrow. Notice of property, boundary dispute. The letter was dense with legal language, but the essential message was clear. There was an error in the property deed from 30 years ago. The coordinates listed for Silas's 3 acres didn't match the actual plot where he'd built the cabin. According to a recent survey commissioned by Frontier Development Corporation, Silas's cabin sat on land that belonged to them. Land they'd purchased 6 months ago as part of a planned residential development. He had 30 days to remove all structures from the property or face legal action. Silas read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking. This couldn't be real. He'd checked the deed carefully before purchasing, had walked the boundaries, had done everything right. But the letter included survey maps, coordinate comparisons, and documentation showing that the original surveyor had made an error decades ago. The plot Silas actually owned was 200 yards to the west, steeper, rockier, nearly unbuildable. Everything they'd worked for, all the months of labor, the money spent, the community support, it was all on the wrong piece of land. When Mara came home an hour later, she found him sitting at the kitchen table, the letter spread in front of him, looking like a man who'd been physically struck. "Dad, what's wrong?" He handed her the letter without speaking. She read it slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to anger. "This can't be legal. They can't just... We've been building for months. Everyone knows we're here." "The coordinates don't lie." His voice came out hollow. "I built on the wrong land. No, we're going to fight this." She pulled out her phone, already searching for lawyers. There has to be something we can do. Squatters' rights, adverse possession, something. Mara, we don't have money for lawyers. Then we'll find someone who'll help. She stopped, seeing the defeat in his eyes. Dad, you can't give up. Not after everything we've been through, but the weight of it was crushing. To lose the cabin to a storm had been devastating, but to lose it to a property line error, to bureaucracy and corporate development, that felt like a different kind of cruelty. The universe telling him he didn't deserve stability, didn't deserve a home. The next morning, Floyd arrived at the property before Silas and Mara did. He was waiting by his truck looking grim. I heard, he said simply. Janet from the church called me. Word spreads fast in small communities. I don't know what to do, Floyd. Silas stood, looking at the cabin, so close to finished, so beautiful in the morning light. I can't afford to move it, and can't afford to fight them in court. Floyd was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked to his truck and pulled out something from the passenger seat. It was an old brass compass, tarnished with age but still functional. This was my surveyor's compass. Used it for 40 years, mapping properties all over this county. He handed it to Silas. I remember when this land was first divided up. Early 1990s. There were problems even then. Young surveyor, rushed work, coordinates that didn't match the physical markers. I flagged several errors in my reports, but the county was overwhelmed with paperwork. Some of those errors never got corrected. You're saying this mistake is 30 years old. I'm saying I've seen frontier development use these old errors before. They buy up land cheap, then discover survey mistakes that let them claim neighboring properties. They did it to the Mitchells 3 years ago, to the Colemans before that. Floyd's expression hardened. I've got a friend, Constance Aldridge. Retired lawyer, sharp as they come. She hates what Frontier's been doing. Let me call her. Hope flickered, small but real. Floyd, I can't pay. She does pro bono work for cases like this. Cases where corporations are taking advantage of regular people. He pulled out his phone. Let me make the call. Within 2 days, Constance Aldridge was sitting in Mara's apartment, reviewing the deed, the survey maps, and the county records Floyd had helped retrieve. She was in her late 60s, grey hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun, reading glasses perched on her nose. This is exactly what I thought, she said, tapping the documents. Frontier Development has been using a shell company to acquire properties with deed errors, then discovering those errors to expand their holdings. They've done this at least 8 times in the last 5 years. Can we fight it? Mara asked. We can. There's legal precedent for adverse possession and for challenging surveys that were improperly conducted. The problem is, she looked at Silas seriously, this will take time and they have expensive lawyers. The 30-day deadline is designed to make you panic and give up. I won't move the cabin, Silas said. We'll fight. Good. I'll need everything you have. Receipts for materials, photos of the construction process, testimony from community members who've known you were building here. We need to show continuous, open use of the land. The next week was a blur of documentation and preparation. Mara created a detailed timeline of the construction, complete with photos she'd taken throughout the process. Janet from the church helped organize community members willing to testify. Floyd dug through old survey records, finding evidence of the original errors and Frontier's pattern of exploitation. Word spread through the county about the dispute. The local newspaper ran a story. Single father faces losing home to corporate development. The response was overwhelming. Letters to the county commissioners, donations to help with legal costs, offers of support from other families who'd faced similar situations. A town hall meeting was scheduled, and Silas found himself standing before a room full of neighbors he barely knew, speaking about his situation. Public speaking had never been his strength, but he forced himself to be honest. I'm not a complicated man, he told the crowd. I lost everything a few years ago. My business, my home, my dignity. This cabin, it's not just a building to me. It's proof that I could still create something, that my daughter and I could work together and build a future. If they take this, they're not just taking land. They're taking hope. The room erupted in applause. Even the county commissioner present looked moved. But the deadline was approaching, and Frontier Development showed no signs of backing down. Constance worked through the case with methodical precision, building their defense piece by piece. She'd found something significant buried in the county records, evidence that Frontier Development had actually commissioned the recent survey that discovered the boundary error. The timing was suspicious, coming just months after they'd purchased the adjacent properties. "They created the problem they're now using against you," Constance explained during a meeting at her office. "That's going to be important in court." The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks away. In the meantime, Silas continued working both at his construction job and on the cabin. He refused to stop, refused to acknowledge the possibility that all this work might be for nothing. Mara had created a social media presence for their story, posting updates that reached far beyond their small county. Messages of support came from across the state, from people who'd faced similar situations or who simply believed in what they were building. A local news station requested an interview. Silas initially refused. He didn't want to be a spectacle, but Mara convinced him. "People need to see you, Dad. They need to hear your story in your own words. It matters." The interview took place at the property, with the nearly finished cabin as a backdrop. The reporter, a young woman named Andrea, asked thoughtful questions about the build, the storm, the legal challenge. "What does this cabin represent to you?" she asked. Silas thought carefully before answering. "It represents the difference between surviving and living. For 3 years I survived. I worked, I moved around, I existed. But I wasn't really living. This cabin, building it with my daughter, creating something permanent, that's living. That's having a future to work toward." The segment aired 2 days later and went viral online. Suddenly, their story wasn't just local news. It was being shared across social media platforms, discussed on radio shows, picked up by regional news outlets. The attention was overwhelming and uncomfortable, but it brought something valuable: pressure on Frontier Development and the county to resolve the situation fairly. Janet organized a petition drive, collecting signatures from community members who opposed Frontier's development plans and supported Silas's right to stay on the land. Within a week they had over 300 signatures. Floyd spent hours with Constance, going through old survey records and providing expert testimony about the original errors. But Silas noticed Floyd was struggling. He moved slower each day, sometimes stopping mid-sentence to catch his breath. His color wasn't good. "You need to see a doctor," Silas told him one afternoon at the property. "Already have. They're running tests." Floyd waved away the concern. "Don't worry about me. We need to focus on your case." "Floyd, Silas, I'm 73 years old. I've lived a good life. Right now, I want to make sure you get to live yours." He smiled tiredly. "Besides, Susan would never forgive me if I didn't see this through. She always believed in helping neighbors." The property documentation Constance requested was extensive. Silas provided receipts for every material purchase, photos from every stage of construction, testimony from suppliers who'd worked with him. Mara compiled a digital presentation showing the timeline of the build, from the first cabin's construction to its destruction in the storm to the current rebuild. Community members came forward with their own stories about Frontier Development's practices. The Ashtons, who'd lost 20 acres to a similar boundary dispute. The Holloways, who'd been pressured to sell at below market prices. A pattern emerged of aggressive land acquisition tactics that bordered on predatory. 5 days before the hearing, Floyd was hospitalized. Silas got the call from Floyd's son, who'd flown in from Arizona. "He collapsed at home," Curtis explained. "They're saying it's his heart. He's stable now, but his voice cracked. He's been refusing treatment for months. Didn't want to worry anyone." Silas visited that evening, finding Floyd in a hospital bed, looking small and tired beneath white sheets. But his eyes were still sharp. "Don't you dare look at me like that," Floyd said. "I'm not dead yet. You should have told me you were sick, and have you worry about me instead of your case." "No, thank you." Floyd shifted in the bed, wincing slightly. "Did Constance get the old survey records I marked?" "She did." "Floyd, rest. The case can wait. The case can't wait. The hearing's in 5 days. He reached for Silas's hand with surprising strength. Listen to me. That compass I gave you, it's not just a tool. It's evidence. I used it on that property in 1993, and my field notes show the original error. Constance knows where to find the records. Use them. I will. And Silas, Floyd's grip tightened. Win this. Not for me, but for what it represents. For everyone who's been pushed around by people with more money and power. Show them that persistence and community matter more than corporate lawyers. I'll try. You'll do more than try. You and Mara, you've already won the important fight. You've rebuilt your relationship, rebuilt your life. The cabin is just wooden nails. What you've created together is what lasts. Silas stayed until visiting hours ended, sitting beside Floyd's bed while the older man drifted in and out of sleep. When he left, he carried the weight of responsibility, not just for himself and Mara, but for everyone who'd supported them, who'd believed their story mattered. The next 3 days were a controlled frenzy of preparation. Constance rehearsed testimony with Silas, teaching him how to speak clearly and directly, how to present himself in court. They prepared exhibits, photos, documents, Floyd's survey notes, the brass compass itself. Mara helped organize community members who would attend the hearing in support. The church had chartered a bus. The local newspaper would have a reporter present. What had started as one man's fight for a piece of land had become something larger, a community standing against corporate overreach. The night before the hearing, Silas couldn't sleep. He walked to the cabin at midnight, letting himself in with the key he'd made weeks ago. The interior was nearly finished. Just a few final touches remained. He ran his hand along the wall, feeling the solid construction beneath the paint. Every nail, every board, every careful measurement represented hours of work, of love, of determination. He thought about Floyd in the hospital, about Mara sacrificing her time and savings, about the community that had rallied around them. Win or lose tomorrow, they'd created something meaningful. But he desperately wanted to win, not for pride, but because this place had become more than shelter. It had become the physical manifestation of starting over, of refusing to give up, of building something that lasted. As dawn broke, Silas stood on the porch watching the sun rise through the trees. Mara's car appeared on the access road right on time. "You ready?" she called as she climbed out. "As ready as I'll ever be." "Then let's go show them what we're made of." The courthouse was an imposing brick building in the county seat, with marble floors and high ceilings that made every sound echo. Silas wore the only dress shirt he owned, pressed carefully by Mara that morning, and felt deeply out of place among the lawyers in their expensive suits. The courtroom was packed. Silas saw Janet and members from the church filling 2 entire rows. Neighbors he barely knew had come to show support. The local newspaper reporter sat in the front, notebook ready. Mara sat directly behind the defendant's table, close enough that he could feel her presence like a steadying hand. Constance sat beside him, her reading glasses perched on her nose, case files organized with meticulous precision. She'd walked him through what to expect, but nothing could fully prepare him for the formal weight of the proceedings. "All rise," the bailiff announced. "The Honorable Judge Patricia Hendricks presiding." Judge Hendricks was a woman in her 60s with steel-grey hair and an expression that suggested she'd heard every excuse and argument imaginable. She settled into her chair and surveyed the crowded courtroom with raised eyebrows. "This appears to be generating significant community interest," she observed. "Let's proceed. I've reviewed the initial filings. Counsel for Frontier Development, you may begin." The lawyer representing Frontier was exactly what Silas expected. Mid-40s, perfectly groomed, carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning. His name was Richard Stanton, and he spoke with practiced smoothness. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter of property law. My client, Frontier Development Corporation, legally purchased the property in question 6 months ago. A recent professional survey revealed that structures have been erected on this property without permission or legal right. The defendant, Mr. Brennan, claims ownership based on a deed with incorrect coordinates, an error made 30 years ago that has no bearing on current legal ownership. Stanton presented his case with clinical efficiency. He showed survey maps, property records, the deed with its coordinate error. Everything was technical, bloodless, reduced to numbers and legal precedent. He brought up a surveyor who testified about the coordinate discrepancy, speaking in terminology that made Silas's head spin. The witness explained how GPS technology had revealed the error, how the boundaries were clearly defined, how there was no ambiguity about which property belonged to whom. Mr. Brennan had 30 days to remove his structure. He has refused. We're simply asking the court to enforce legal property rights and order the removal of an unpermitted building from land that belongs to my client. This isn't personal. It's about maintaining the integrity of property law. If we allow people to build on land they don't own, regardless of their intentions, we undermine the entire system of property rights that our society depends on. Stanton's argument was compelling in its logic, and Silas felt his stomach tighten. The lawyer made it sound so reasonable, so obvious. Just a matter of enforcing basic rules. Constance stood when it was her turn, and despite her age, she commanded the room immediately. Your Honor, the defense will show that this case is far more complex than a simple property dispute. Frontier Development has engaged in a pattern of using historical survey errors to expand their land holdings at the expense of good faith property owners. This is the 9th such case in 5 years. She presented documentation. The other cases Floyd had helped her research, showing a clear pattern of behavior. She introduced Floyd's brass compass and his original field notes from 1993, which showed the coordinate error and his attempts to flag it at the time. Mr. Floyd Hutchins, a respected surveyor with 40 years of experience, documented these errors 3 decades ago. He submitted reports to the county identifying the discrepancies. The county failed to correct them. Now, 30 years later, Frontier Development is exploiting those uncorrected errors for profit. They're not innocent property owners protecting their rights. They're a corporation systematically using bureaucratic failures to take land from people who've acted in good faith. Judge Hendricks leaned forward, interested. And Mr. Hutchins is available to testify? He's currently hospitalized, Your Honor, but we have his sworn deposition and comprehensive documentation. His field notes from 1993 clearly show that he identified the coordinate error and reported it through proper channels. The failure to correct that error lies with the county, not with Mr. Brennan. The morning proceeded with technical testimony about property surveys, boundary markers, and legal precedents. An expert witness for the defense explained how common survey errors were in the early 1990s, when technology was less precise and county record-keeping was often inadequate. Another witness, a retired county clerk, testified about the backlog of corrections that had never been processed. Stanton argued that regardless of the original error, Silas had built on land he didn't own. He brought up cases where property disputes had been resolved in favor of legal title holders, emphasizing that good intentions didn't override clear property rights. Constance countered with evidence of adverse possession. Silas had used the land openly for months, with the knowledge of the community, making improvements in good faith. She cited precedents where courts had protected property owners who'd relied on official records, even when those records contained errors. The defendant believed he was building on his own property, Constance argued. He purchased the land legally, relied on county records that the county itself had certified, and has invested significant resources based on that good faith belief. He's made no attempt to hide his construction. Everyone in the community knew about it. To allow Frontier Development to profit from exploiting a decades-old error that the county should have corrected would be fundamentally unjust and would set a dangerous precedent. By midday, Judge Hendricks called for a lunch recess. Silas stepped outside with Mara, feeling drained by the formal proceedings. The technical arguments, the legal terminology, the careful dance of courtroom procedure, it all felt removed from the reality of what they'd built, from the months of labor and the meaning behind it. "You're doing great," Mara said. "Constance is destroying their arguments." "It's not about destroying arguments. It's about what's legal." Silas looked back at the courthouse, at the imposing building that would decide his fate. "The law might not care about fairness, then we'll make them care. We'll show them what this really means." After lunch, community members were called to testify. Janet spoke about the church's support and the community's knowledge of Silas's construction project. She described the donations they'd collected, the volunteers who'd helped, the way the story had resonated with people across the county. "This isn't just about one man and one cabin," she testified. "It's about whether we value honest work and community support, or whether we let corporations use technicalities to take advantage of good people." Several neighbors confirmed they'd seen Silas working on the land for months, that everyone knew about the cabin, that he'd never tried to hide what he was doing. Their testimony established the open and obvious nature of his possession. Then came testimony from families who'd faced similar situations with frontier development. The Ashtons described losing 20 acres to a boundary dispute that used the same tactics, an old survey error suddenly discovered after Frontier bought adjacent land. The Holloways explained how they'd been pressured to sell when survey discrepancies appeared in their deed, discrepancies that hadn't existed in previous county records. Judge Hendricks listened carefully, making notes, her expression unreadable. But Silas thought he detected something in her posture, a stiffening when the pattern became clear, a sharpness in her gaze when Stanton tried to dismiss the similarities as coincidence. Finally, Constance called Silas to the stand. He walked to the witness box on unsteady legs, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. The courtroom felt enormous, all those eyes watching him, judging him, deciding whether his story mattered. Constance began with easy questions. His name, his age, his work history, how he'd found the property. Silas answered clearly, the way she'd coached him, keeping his responses direct and honest. "Mr. Brennan, tell the court about building the cabin." He took a breath and began. He described living in the van, working odd jobs across the county, saving every dollar to buy the land. He explained the months of construction, building the first cabin alone, with salvaged materials and determination. The storm that destroyed it. Standing in the rain looking at the wreckage. The decision to rebuild with Mara's help. "Why was this cabin so important to you?" Constance asked. Silas thought about Floyd's words in the hospital, about what home really meant. "For 3 years, I survived. I worked, I moved around, but I wasn't really living. I was just getting through each day, trying not to think too hard about how I'd lost everything. This cabin, building it with my daughter, gave me something to work toward. A future, a place where we could be a family again." Constance thanked Silas and sat down. The courtroom remained quiet, the weight of his testimony hanging in the air. Stanton stood for cross-examination, his expression carefully neutral. He approached the witness stand with measured steps, holding a manila folder. "Mr. Brennan, did you hire a professional surveyor before building your cabin?" "No, sir. I couldn't afford one." "Did you obtain building permits from the county?" "The county office told me permits weren't required for structures under 400 square feet on private land." But you weren't on your private land, were you?" Stanton's tone was matter-of-fact, not accusatory, which somehow made it worse. Silas met his eyes steadily. "I believed I was. The deed I purchased showed those coordinates. I walked the boundaries based on the markers that were there. I had no reason to think otherwise." Stanton circled back to technical details, trying to establish that Silas had been negligent, that a professional survey would have revealed the error. He pulled out documents showing the cost of basic surveys, suggesting they were affordable, that any reasonable person would have obtained one before making such a significant investment. "Mr. Brennan, you spent months building this cabin. You invested your savings. Wouldn't a few $100s for a professional survey have been a wise precaution?" "In hindsight, yes. But I was living in a van, sir. Every dollar went to materials or food. I trusted the county records because that's what they're supposed to be for, to tell people what land they own. But trust isn't the same as due diligence, is it?" Constance had prepared him for this line of questioning. Silas kept his voice calm, reasonable. I did everything a man in my situation could do. I checked the deed, I walked the property lines, I looked at the markers that were already there. Those markers had been in place for decades. The error wasn't mine. It was made 30 years ago by a surveyor who didn't do his job properly, and it was never corrected by a county office that should have caught it. Stanton tried another angle. You mentioned you've been homeless for 3 years. During that time, did you maintain steady employment? I worked constantly. Carpentry jobs, construction, whatever I could find. But you moved frequently? Never staying in one place long. I went where the work was. So, you have a history of, let's say, transience, moving around, not putting down roots. Why should this court believe this cabin represents something permanent rather than just another temporary situation? Silas felt anger flash through him, but kept it controlled. Because I bought land, because I built something with my own hands, because my daughter and I worked together for months to create something that would last. That's not transience. That's building a future. Stanton looked at the photograph. Still sitting on the witness stand, young Mara beside the unfinished treehouse. You mentioned this photograph represents unfinished business, a project you abandoned. How do we know you won't abandon this cabin as well? I didn't abandon that treehouse by choice. I lost my business, my home, my marriage. Everything fell apart. Silas's voice grew stronger, but I never stopped being a father. I never stopped working. And when I finally had a chance to build something permanent, I took it. That's not abandonment, that's persistence. The exchange continued for another 20 minutes. But Stanton couldn't shake Silas's fundamental position. He'd acted in good faith, relied on official records, and built something meaningful with honest labor. When Silas finally stepped down, Constance called Mara to the stand. She walked up confidently, wearing a simple dress, but carrying herself with the quiet strength of someone who'd spent months doing hard physical work. Miss Brennan, tell us about your involvement in building this cabin. Mara described taking time off work, using her savings, learning carpentry alongside her father. She spoke about the storm, the decision to rebuild, the months of working together. Her voice was clear and direct, without unnecessary emotion, but with absolute conviction. My father taught me that finishing what you start matters, she said, even if it takes years, even if it's hard. This cabin isn't just a building to us. It's proof that you can lose everything and still create something meaningful. It's proof that family matters more than failure. Stanton's cross-examination tried to paint her as someone swept up in her father's poor decisions, wasting her youth on a doomed project. Miss Brennan, you're 24 years old. Don't you think your time and money would have been better spent on education? On building your career? I am building my career. I've been accepted to trade school to become a licensed contractor. Everything I learned, building this cabin, that's my education. That's real-world experience you can't get in a classroom. But if this court rules against your father, all that work will have been for nothing. Mara's eyes flashed. It won't have been for nothing. I learned skills that will serve me for life. I rebuilt my relationship with my father. I learned what I'm capable of. That has value regardless of what happens to the cabin. She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on an edge. And frankly, Mr. Stanton, what Frontier Development is doing, using old paperwork errors to take people's property, that's wrong. Everyone in this courtroom knows it's wrong. The question is whether this court cares more about technical coordinates or about actual justice. Judge Hendricks raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. After Mara stepped down, Constance delivered her closing argument. She stood before the judge with quiet authority, her years of experience evident in every word. Your Honor, the law isn't just about coordinates and surveys. It's about fairness, about protecting people who follow the rules in good faith. Mr. Brennan did everything right. He bought property legally. He built carefully according to what he understood to be his rights. He invested everything he had. Frontier Development is trying to profit from a 30-year-old error that the county should have corrected decades ago. She gestured to the community members filling the courtroom. This community has rallied around Mr. Brennan not because they're sentimental, but because they recognize that what's happening here is wrong. They've seen frontier development use these tactics before. They know this isn't about protecting property rights. It's about corporate exploitation of bureaucratic failures. Constance placed Floyd's brass compass on the evidence table. Floyd Hutchins spent 40 years as a surveyor in this county. He documented this error in 1993. He tried to get it corrected. The system failed. Now, frontier development wants to profit from that failure. To allow this would be to reward predatory behavior and punish honest work. Stanton's closing argument was smooth and professional. He spoke about the importance of clear property boundaries, about the precedent that would be set if courts started invalidating legal ownership based on sympathetic circumstances. He was logical, measured, and completely disconnected from the human reality of what he was arguing for. The law must be applied consistently, he concluded. Regardless of how we might feel about Mr. Brennan's situation, we cannot simply ignore legal property boundaries because someone built something without proper verification. That would create chaos in our property system. Judge Hendricks leaned back in her chair, studying both lawyers, then looking at Silas and Mara. The courtroom held its breath. Judge Hendricks looked at the documents before her, then at the packed courtroom. "I'm going to take a 30-minute recess to review the evidence. We'll reconvene for my ruling." Those 30 minutes felt like hours. Silas sat on a bench outside the courtroom with Mara, neither of them speaking. Constance reviewed her notes nearby. Community members gathered in quiet groups, waiting. The marble hallway echoed with hushed conversations and nervous footsteps. When they were called back in, Judge Hendricks looked serious, her expression revealing nothing. "I've reviewed the evidence, the testimony, and the relevant case law. This is indeed a complex situation." She paused, and Silas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. "The coordinate error in Mr. Brennan's deed is documented and clear. Technically, the structure he built sits on property owned by Frontier Development." Silas felt the floor drop out from under him. Mara reached for his hand. "However," Judge Hendricks continued, her voice sharpening, "I'm deeply troubled by the pattern of behavior demonstrated by Frontier Development. This is the 9th case in 5 years where they've used historical survey errors to expand their holdings. That suggests not good faith property management, but systematic exploitation of bureaucratic failures." She looked directly at Stanton. "Your client commissioned the survey that discovered this error mere months after purchasing adjacent property. The timing is suspicious at best, and at worst suggests a deliberate strategy to acquire land through technical manipulation rather than honest purchase." Judge Hendricks turned to her documents. "Mr. Brennan acted in good faith, relying on county records that the county itself had certified as accurate. He's made substantial improvements to the property with community knowledge and support. The original survey error was documented by Mr. Hutchins 30 years ago, and the county failed to correct it despite proper notification." She looked up, her decision clear in her expression. "I'm ruling in favor of the defendant. The deed coordinates will be corrected to reflect the actual property Mr. Brennan has been occupying and improving. Frontier Development's claim is denied. Furthermore, I'm recommending that the county conduct a comprehensive review of all properties in this area to identify and correct similar errors before they can be exploited further." The courtroom erupted in cheers. People stood applauding. Mara grabbed Silas in a fierce hug, and he felt tears streaming down his face. Constance allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. Stanton looked stunned, already gathering papers, his corporate composure cracked. But then Silas's phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. He pulled it out with shaking hands and saw a number he recognized, the hospital. He stepped into the hallway, Mara following close behind. The celebration continued inside, but Silas's world had narrowed to the voice on the phone. "Mr. Brennan, this is County General Hospital. I'm calling about Floyd Hutchins. I'm very sorry to inform you that he passed away approximately 20 minutes ago. His son Curtis asked us to contact you. Mr. Hutchins had left specific instructions. He wanted you to know that he wasn't worried, and that you should finish the cabin." Silas stood in the courthouse hallway, surrounded by celebrating community members who didn't yet understand, and felt the victory turn bittersweet. Floyd had believed they would win, had known they would win, and he'd held on just long enough. "Dad," Mara's voice was gentle. "What is it?" "Floyd's gone. He died during the hearing." She wrapped her arms around him while people celebrated nearby, not understanding that the man who'd made this victory possible wouldn't see the finished cabin, wouldn't stand on the porch and admire the work, wouldn't know that his compass and his testimony had saved everything. 2 months later, on a crisp January morning, Silas stood in front of the completed cabin and felt the profound weight of everything that had brought him here. The structure was finished, walls painted a warm cream, metal roof gleaming in the winter sun, windows reflecting the surrounding pines. Smoke rose from the chimney where the wood stove burned steadily. Today was Floyd's memorial service, held here at the cabin at Curtis's request. Floyd had left instructions that he didn't want a traditional funeral, but rather a gathering of friends at a place that meant something. People arrived throughout the morning. Janet and the church group, neighbors from surrounding properties, Constance with her husband, even some of the families who testified about their struggles with frontier development. They gathered in the clearing, perhaps 50 people, standing in the cold to honor a man who'd believed in helping others. Silas had been asked to speak. He stood before the group, feeling the responsibility of capturing what Floyd had meant. "Floyd Hutchins was my neighbor," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion. But he became much more than that. He became a teacher, a friend, and the reason this cabin exists. He told them about Floyd's first visit after the storm, about the materials donated, the wisdom shared, the brass compass that proved crucial in court. He spoke about Floyd's late wife, Susan, and how Floyd had understood what it meant to build a home with someone you loved. "Floyd told me that home isn't just built with wooden nails, it's built with persistence and community. He showed me that by being exactly the kind of neighbor everyone deserves. This place stands because Floyd Hutchins believed it should, because he believed I deserved a second chance." After the service, people toured the cabin. Silas had installed the hand-carved door handle that morning, the oak piece with its intricate leaf pattern catching the light. Above the door, Mara had mounted a brass plaque reading "Brennan and Brennan." The interior was simple but complete. A kitchen area along one wall, the wood stove radiating warmth, a sitting area with furniture Silas had built. The sleeping loft was accessible by a sturdy ladder, and the small bathroom had working plumbing. It wasn't large or fancy, but it was solid, warm, and home. Curtis found Silas on the porch as people were leaving. "Dad would have loved seeing this finished. He talked about you constantly. Said watching you build reminded him of his best years with Mom. I wish he could have seen it. He did, in a way. He knew you'd finish." Curtis handed him Floyd's brass compass. "He wanted you to have this. Said every builder needs to know where he stands." After everyone left, Silas and Mara sat on the porch in the quiet afternoon. Christine had visited earlier, genuinely impressed by what they'd accomplished, and a tentative peace had formed between the former spouses. "I start trade school next week," Mara said. "I've decided to live here while I'm studying, if that's okay. This is your home too, for as long as you want it." Over the following weeks, they settled into a new rhythm. Mara transformed the loft into her space. Silas continued his construction work, but now he returned each evening to a real home, to dinner with his daughter, to conversations about her classes and his projects. One evening in late February, Silas stood on the porch, watching the sun set through the trees. He thought about the journey, the business lost, the years in the van, the first cabin destroyed, the legal battle, Floyd's death. Each setback had felt impossible, but each had taught him about persistence, community, and what truly mattered. He picked up his old carpenter's hammer and ran his thumb along the taped handle. Some things were worth holding on to, worth repairing instead of replacing, worth believing in even when everything suggested giving up. He'd built 2 cabins on this land. The first taught him he could still create something meaningful. The second taught him he didn't have to do it alone. The cabin would stand for decades, but more important than the building was what it represented. A father and daughter who'd found their way back to each other, one board at a time.